Adnan Syed is out. He is free for the time being. And for those of you who may not know, let me take a step back. Adnan Syed was the subject of the inaugural season of the Serial podcast. And the Serial podcast is arguably one of the biggest podcasts ever, especially season 1. I think it kind of fell off in subsequent seasons. And in my opinion, created the whole true crime genre within podcasting, or at least gave it like a huge push. It was investigated the story was investigated and hosted by Sarah Koenig. And I'm sure, it was, again, one of the biggest podcasts ever. So I'm sure folks have their own, connections to it. Me personally, the story hit home even more because it was about high school kids in 1999. I was a high school kid in 1999. The story also came out around the time that I was starting my podcast, the Spun Today podcast, back in 2014. I had been doing it already for a bit, but it's right around that same time, I believe, because I started the Spun Today podcast in September of 2014, and the Serial podcast came out in the fall of 2014. So yeah, right around the same time. And let me give you the synopsis of the first episode for those of you who may have been living under a rock for the past decade. Episode number 1 of season 1 is called The Alibi, and it states, "It's Baltimore, 1999. Heyman Lee, a popular high school senior, disappears after school one day. 6 weeks later, detectives arrest her classmate and ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed, for her murder. He says he's innocent, though he can't exactly remember what he was doing on that January afternoon. But someone can. A classmate at Woodlawn High School says she knows where Adnan was. The trouble is, she's nowhere to be found." And it was just so brilliantly delivered. The story was so well investigated by Sarah Koenig from a journalistic perspective, so thoughtfully presented from a podcast perspective, like to such a high level of quality and consideration. And not to be disrespectful or anything to all the parties involved, but the entertainment value of it was through the roof. Again, a testament to the whole, true crime genre, how we're all gravitated towards these kinds of stories. But that attention garnering delivery is what a couple decades since his incarceration ultimately helps lead to Adnan getting out of prison. And again, the Serial podcast, it's a great first season. I'll link to the website in the episode notes so that you guys can listen to all the episodes there, or add it to your podcatcher of your choice, Spotify, iTunes, etc. But it's a series that I listen to every so often. I remember when it came out, I would listen to every episode instantly as soon as it came out. I think it was like every other Wednesday or Thursday they would air a new episode. There's a total of 12 episodes. I re-listened to all 12 episodes several times. I try to go back and re-listen, I think like every year or two, just because it's so good. And there's now 13 episodes because Sarah Koenig put out another episode after the news of Adnan getting out. It was all over the news. I'm sure you guys, if you were a follower of Serial or this story in general, it would have come across your radar through either the New York Times or social media or Yahoo or just podcasts in general. And I'll link to some of that stuff within the episode notes, but I wanted to share just a few takeaways of why, after so many years, he's let out, because there have been motions filed and appeals that have fallen through, etc. over the years. So why now? What happened now? And here are some of the things that Sarah highlights during episode 13 of that first season of the Serial podcast, which again is an episode that was recently recorded along with the news of Adnan being out. Well, before I jump into this, just something that I just remembered that is definitely worth mentioning in terms of like the delivery of the Serial podcast. It's so well crafted because along with Sarah's reporting and, narrating of everything, she has interviews with all, the main people from, Adnan's like circle of friends and Heyman Lee's circle of friends. They were, friends and a couple in high school. Like they were together on and off. they had the same circle of friends. And she has interviews with all these people. She has the court case excerpts, and you can hear the actual like audio from the court case when he initially got arrested. She has that interview with a girl whose name is escaping me right now, but that had written Adnan a letter after he got arrested saying, "Hey, why didn't you tell them that you were with me in the library that day? And you weren't with Hae. I remember seeing you there. Did you forget? We were there talking, whatever, blah, blah, blah." Which was like the same exact time that they were saying Hae Min Lee's like time of death. So he clearly had an alibi, but that information like wasn't included in the original court case, and it was just like so much shit that again makes you wonder how holes like this are allowable within the criminal justice system. But I digress. It's just amazingly narrated and delivered, and definitely worth a listen. But anyway, so there's someone by the name of Becky Feldman and someone by the name of Mrs. Suter. I don't remember which one is which, but one of them is his new attorney, if I'm not mistaken. And they took on Adnan's case, this new attorney, and they wanted to go through all the case evidence from the original trial. So they go to where that's stored. I'm assuming somewhere like within the state or something like that. And she was pretty much told, here, it's these 17 boxes, go through whatever you want, make copies of whatever you want, etc. She starts going through these 17 boxes, goes through like the first 7 of them, makes a bunch of copies, and then heads back to her office to, start going through things and seeing, what she can add to this case, what she can discover that possibly wasn't brought forth properly. And she comes across a bunch of like handwritten notes about potential alternate suspects. And these are notes from the detectives investigating the case and from the prosecution side, prosecuting against Adnan. And get this, the notes showed a couple of potential alternate suspects, one of which had a motive to kill Hae Min Lee and literally threatened to kill Hae Min Lee. The other suspect, for those of you who are familiar with the case, Hae's car, where she was killed in her car, she was strangled in her car, was missing. And it was found like next to or behind the house of this other potential suspect, none of which are Adnan Syed, which is her ex-boyfriend, which was in jail for 23 years. 23 years. I want to underscore and highlight that. Now, this is how she ultimately gets him out. That information was never presented or given to the defense. And as we all know from watching My Cousin Vinny, that's funny how that's like literally the extent of my legal knowledge. But the defense and prosecution have to share with each other all the evidence and stuff that they have on a particular case, because they are both, even though they're on either side of the case, one is prosecuting, one is defending, they are both in the joint pursuit of justice, quote unquote. The fact that the prosecution did not hand over this information is something called a Brady violation. And based on that happenstance of her choosing those 7 out of the 17 boxes to go through, and then within those 7 boxes, choosing those particular handwritten notes to like photocopy and take back to her office, and then choosing or finding and pinpointing that information within all the stacks of paperwork. Based on all that, this Brady violation was discovered. And with that, a motion was filed and upheld by a judge to let Adnan out of prison. And now the next steps are going to be if they're A, going to retry him, or B, just drop all charges altogether. The motion also shows, which is where the like previous motions and appeals fell through and were a bit light, that the star witness testimony of Jay Wilds, which was a friend of Adnan's, that if you listen to the podcast, had this really shaky story of what he knew and what he didn't know. And he did happen to know where Hae Min Lee's car was, but he made up this wild shit of borrowing Adnan's car and borrowing Adnan's phone one day, and that Adnan showed him Hae Min's dead body and said, she's with somebody else or something like that, so I'm gonna kill her, and like just made up a whole bunch of shit. And there was so many holes within his story that were really clear through like the interrogation tapes, which again, Sarah Koenig put out, and it was like there was like so many like leading questions, and it's like one of those sadly common stories of, again, there's another issue within like the legal justice system of, you know, put somebody in an interrogation room for X amount of time and they'll tell you whatever you want them to tell you, just like a matter of time. Like people break, right? No sleep, no food, no water, no, you know, just like leading questions. Also, you know, IQ plays a factor, and, you know, being a child, being a young kid, impressionable, and you have, you know, two cops playing good cop, bad cop with you, literally telling you, no, wait, don't you mean this? No, wait, don't you mean that? Pausing the tape, then re-recording, and just a whole bunch of wild shit. Anyway, Adnan went to jail based on that star witnesses testimony, and the second thing that put him away was phone records, which literally stated at the time, like on the actual phone records, it stated something to the effect, like from the phone company, you know, pinged towers cannot be reliably used as location of where a phone call was made, because if you make a phone call, it like pings a nearby cell tower like a satellite, and it, you know, beams your call request to the other phone or whatever. But it literally stated that on the phone records that they're not reliable sources of, you know, location. But they use those phone records to say this is where Adnan was, this is where he was making calls from, he was here, Heyman, his phone pinged the cell tower here, that's close enough to Heyman's body, he had X amount of time to go between here and there. And if I remember correctly, they also, let's say there were like 10 phone calls made, you know, off the top of my head, they used like 3 of those phone calls and ignored the other 7 phone calls that were like miles away, and said, see, these 3 phone calls, these are the ones we're submitting as evidence, and he made these, you know, close enough to around the same time that she died, and it was close enough to around where we found her body, etc., etc. So anyway, that motion that shows that Brady violation also shows that the Jay Wilds testimony, as well as those phone records, which were the only 2 things that put him in jail in the first place, no longer hold up. So all that together got Adnan out of jail. And here's something that within the New York Times article, the person interviewing her posed this question to Sarah Koenig, and I think she summed it up perfectly. He asks, the latest events in this case are reminiscent of the fallout from In the Dark, quote unquote, which is a podcast whose reporting helped free Curtis Flowers, a Mississippi man who'd been jailed for more than 20 years for murders he evidently did not commit. Wrongful conviction seems to be a major problem in the US. What parts of Syed's case do you think are systemic? He posed this question again to Sarah Koenig, the host of the Serial podcast. And she replied, where to begin? Questionable interrogation tactics and tunnel vision by police, an overtaxed system that fails to properly interrogate evidence. So I just want to pause there real quick. Those first 2 are, again, the interrogation tactics that we were just speaking about, the tunnel vision of police, which I want to highlight as the incentives to, because if you're a cop, it's a job, right? Like any other job, and not like any other job, like downplaying it like it's something easy to do. It's obviously very hard to do if you do it correctly. If you do, you know, you care about your job, you care about people, you care about justice. It's a heroic undertaking, but it's, what I mean by it's like any other job, you have people that are good at it, you have people that are bad at it, and everyone in between. When you, in any job, especially one like this where the stakes are so high, have incentives in place for closing cases, locking people up, you're opening up the possibility for fuckery, for the people to fuck with the data, to skew the numbers, if you will. And those incentives could be anything from getting off from work early, getting off the street early because you could just go back to the office, file some, you know, say you're working on paperwork for 8 hours, even though it really takes you like 2 hours, so you get like 6 hours free, you know, quotas that certain departments and certain cops have. Things like this are all different types of incentives, right? That type of structure shouldn't exist within this type of work, in my opinion, because again, it leads to the possibility of that type of fuckery. And cops, again, getting tunnel visioned, and this is the kid that I think did it. I know we have these other 2 potential suspects, but it makes much more sense. The story's easier to sell if we say the ex-boyfriend did it because you tell us that she now has another boyfriend. So let's not pursue the other ones. Let's pin it on this kid. And we have enough evidence that clearly we can use to make this an open shut case. And we get the kudos for it and whatever, again, incentives come with that, come with making it an open shut case. Now, going back to Sarah Koenig's response. So she says the tunnel vision by police, an overtaxed system that fails to properly interrogate evidence. Again, this is one of my biggest gripes to the criminal justice system. And it does stem from the fact that the system is overtaxed. There's not enough judges, not enough lawyers, apparently, not enough time to, thoroughly enough investigate every single case. There has to be like some level of like efficiency and flow to these processes. But when it's overtaxed to the point where certain types of evidence can't be submitted because of like technicalities and the wrong paperwork, and you wrote this on the green sheet of paper instead of the pink sheet of paper, so it's inadmissible, or this, that, and the other, like all the other legal mumbo jumbo jargon shit that leaves out pertinent information and real evidence, like the fact of these two other potential suspects, which seem very much so to be the ones that really did this, then that's a fault in the system. That's something that shouldn't be, right? It shouldn't be that way. What the fix is exactly, I don't know. I'm more so here highlighting problems, right? Not offering solutions, which isn't a good thing. But I guess I would start by heavier deterrence when there is something like this Brady violation. Like the people involved in that, directly involved in that Brady violation, you didn't do your job properly as a prosecuting attorney and didn't hand over this evidence, you're disbarred, period. You're no longer a lawyer. You can no longer practice law. Find them, see how that works in terms of level of deterrent. And then if that still doesn't work and you still have all this fuckery going on in the future, impose jail sentences if you need to. Like that can't just be like, oh, you had a Brady violation, slap on the wrist. Oh, that was 10 years ago. Oops, my bad. Oh, that was 23 years ago. Somebody's been in jail because I decided not to do my job properly and let the defense know that there were these other suspects. Like, no, that can't be. You know what I mean? Like, you need strong enough deterrence to deter that type of behavior, which again is an incentive from the prosecution side, because they want to win the case, obviously, just like the defense wants to win the case. But the prosecution had that incentive of, let me not tell them about these two suspects so it can be an open shut case and I can win my case. Those incentives, man, are a motherfucker. You got to align them up properly to align with justice versus aligning with winning and losing. Anyway. So back to Sarah Koenig's response. She says, an overtaxed system that fails to properly interrogate evidence, prosecutors withholding evidence from the defense, our country's tolerance for insanely long prison sentences, juveniles treated as adults when science tells us they aren't. I'm assuming she's alluding to the fact that our like prefrontal cortex doesn't fully form until the age of 24, 25, I believe, which is where we get like our reasoning and logic from. There's something to be said to that, although I am also of the mindset of it depends. If you do commit an atrocious enough act, it's like, sorry kid, you're fucked. Like, you fucked up your life. Your life's done. Then she goes on to say racism and also how grindingly difficult it is to get the system to take another look at your case once you've been convicted, which is another huge, probably like my second biggest gripe with the criminal justice system. It's like you have to, again, go through these certain specific legal hoops in order to get a case relooked at, which again is a testament to how overtaxed the system is. They don't want to keep retrying cases. The system is clogged up as is, which is, I guess you can say, a root cause to like that specific issue. But it shouldn't be the case. It shouldn't be that you can only retry, based on those like two specific things, which is one, if you can prove ineffective counsel at the time of your case, or prove that there was some evidence at the time, evidence that could have been used at the time that wasn't, because then it leaves out evidence that, like future evidence that gets discovered. And it's like, that based on the technicality, that evidence didn't exist back then, so you would have went to jail anyway. It's like, no, motherfucker. Like, look, here's the proof. It didn't exist then. I don't give a fuck. It exists now. Like, I'm innocent. You know what I mean? It's like, pisses me off. Then she goes on to say, again, in speaking to all the things that are wrong with the system, prosecutors and cops who don't police themselves and then doubled down when they're accused of doing something wrong. And she ends it with, it's pretty much, you name it, this case has it. And this case really did have all of that shit. One of the two suspects, by the way, are in jail now on sexual assault charges. One of them, again, to reiterate, literally had a motive and told Hae-Min Lee that they were going to kill her. Speaking of like the detectives not holding themselves accountable, one of the two detectives that were in charge of investigating the Adnan case, he was accused of fabricating evidence, manipulating evidence, not following up on evidence, pointing to a different suspect, and not showing exculpatory evidence in another case around the same time Adnan's case was going on, which again goes to show the drive and the incentive to close your case for whatever reason. Like, it's your job to close cases, your incentive is going to be to close the cases, especially if that you're incentivized by other things like I mentioned before, like extra vacation time, less time on the street, less time doing paperwork, so on and so forth. Trivial shit, ultimately. But yeah, shout out to Serial, shout out to the power of podcasts, shout out to the attorneys and judges who do their jobs well, do it in the right way with the right intentions. Shout out to Adnan, who after 23 years is out and with his family. And I hope that I mean, on one side, I want to say that I hope they just drop the charges altogether, because I just believe he's innocent. But I know you shouldn't base something like that based on belief. But at the very least, I hope that if the case gets retried, it's well-intentioned, without the ulterior motives of let's just pin it on Adnan because it's a black eye, it's a blemish on the Baltimore Police Department and DA's office, etc. And that they are once and for all able to achieve true justice to the main victim of this entire situation, which is Hae-Min Lee, who lost her life and whose killer or killers may have been roaming free for the past 23 years. And the last thing I'll say about it is a quote from Sarah Koenig, which kind of underscores my main gripe, again, with the criminal justice system and just like the fact that this type of thing can happen. And she mentioned this on the podcast. And she said, quote, "Everything known now was known or knowable in 1999. But we built a system that takes 20 plus years to self-correct."